Okay, I am back. Sorry for that.
It's all
No,
good.
it's all good, man.
We
um,
just more or less pointed out that while trade stuff is helpful, that's not really what school should be about. It should be about um, in a way from what I always kind of have as my sort of philosophy here is that school should be about teaching kids to question everything and to be able to disassemble an idea.
Yep, yep.
I actually live. I do my best to live by a single rule, which is if anybody's talking to you about anything, they are trying to persuade you of something.
More or less.
mhm.
Like literally, it's. I mean, even if somebody just says hello to you, they are trying to convince you that you are somebody that they want to talk to. Like you can, like obviously, it gets a little more reachy and nonsensey the more you try to think about it. But really, at the end of the day, I find that it's a helpful frame of mind to sort of like remind yourself to disassemble things that people say.
Hmm.
If I may. So my point about teaching skills wasn't necessarily teaching about trade skills per se, but preparing kids on how to survive in the real world. Teaching them
Right. Life
usable
skills.
skills, life skills that don't necessarily get covered by either due to failings of people's parents or possibly if the parents, may not have the time, because I know that's a problem in working families, is that, from what I was looking at, as a part of working families, is that they're much busier in different ways. They work constantly. They don't really have time to talk with their kids. They may sit them in front of a TV and just let them go, or may send them out with friends or something. So they may not have the time or the energy or just the care to teach kids, responsible life skills, which would ultimately then, unfortunately, fall to the education system to make sure that we have a educated populace on how to do some extremely basic things, opening up a bank account, getting a loan, getting a car, where do you go if you need X, Y, or Z kind of thing, assistance and such.
Right.
Preparing people for a life after high school and after general school itself, because most people, you always hear that old cliche thing. You turn 18, you're sent out into the world, go. But nobody ever prepares you on how to go. Nobody tells you, nobody gives you assistance. Somebody's like, so you need to go here, here, and here if you need this. They're just like, go, get a job, go to college, just succeed without really backing that up with anything.
I think a lot of that in particular, the whole just go and do it. I think it comes a lot from our tendency as a country, like our national history of individualism, where I succeed because I'm good at this.
Yeah,
I'm smart,
I
and
am so against the cult of the individual in this country. It's ridiculous.
I'm.
why would I know this is off topic, but let me ask why.
Well, because this idea that people rise and fall on their own, people's actions are completely their own. It's complete bullshit. It's a way for people to distract from the effects that society has on people. It's the idea that like for instance, let's go with school shootings. There's a school shooter or there's any sort of mass shooting, and you know more if unless they're connected to some undesirable political ideology in some way, they're always labeled as, oh, it was just this one person. It was just the lone act of a lone wolf, and he had problems. And it's like, okay, well, if it's just a lone thing, like why does it keep happening?
Hmm.
There's obviously some sort of societal inclination that pushes people towards committing these kinds of acts if it only happens here and nowhere else. And yet we just continue to be reactive to it instead of proactive about it.
On that point, I think part of that has to do with the stigmatization of mental health in this country. For the longest time in this country's history, mental health has always been seen as a very stigmatized thing. You don't talk about it. You don't know anybody who's gone through it. It's all hush hush behind the scenes. And then, along with not necessarily a bullying culture, but definitely there are students who get bullied or whatever, and then that builds a sense of repressed rage or something that they may not know how to functionally get out. And without having the proper people in place to maybe like catch that, to see, this person's getting bullied, this person's having issues, maybe I should check with them or talk with their parents and, do a home follow-up or something, to take the extra steps to make sure that this student is getting the help they need, and also to, of course, stop the culture in the school itself that's perpetuating that damage and hurt to that student. It's we have a culture in schools. It's just, it's not my problem. I'm not seeing it. It is out of sight, out of mind. That's what I think rises and what gives prominence to these school shooters. Is if you look at their history, for the ones unassociated with terrorist organizations, it's people who were the downtrodden, who didn't have many friends, who were loners, and just kept to themselves in a way that was extremely unhealthy and built a lot of negative and repressed rage against everybody around them.
Yeah, again, that just sort of feeds into my my point that we focus too much on the individual, which also aids in a way with with the population at whole. It's a lot easier for a government to handle a group of individuals as it is for them to deal with a community. A group of individuals, while they might work together in some capacity, are still going to be, they're still going to be their own people. They're going to be acting on their own whims. They're still isolated, which is why the whole idea of the nuclear family has become such a powerful thing in the past 100 years. Whereas before that, it was big communal houses. You have several generations of family all living together. But now, we focus way too heavily on, you got the husband, the wife, and the kids, and you all live in this big house by yourself, and it's unnecessary. And it's so isolating to live like that when we are a communal species. Like, that's how we lived for many thousands of years until somebody decided, hey, we should all have our own houses now.
I think that has a lot to do with you as an individual. So as me as an individual, I don't necessarily care too much about living in a community because, fuck it, I don't need them. To just describe it very simply, what do I need them for? Okay, if I don't need them, again, as an individual, why would I keep them around? But I think the idea of the individual, in our country is so heavy, has persisted for so long and so heavily because of our foundation. We were, at the very beginning, a bunch of loosely conglomerated states that just kind of did our own thing, did our own law. And that bred a very strong sense of we are who we are, and, you can kiss our ass, basically. It is what it is. But even past, the initial creation of the country, we go to the West, okay? There is no community, basically, out in the West at the beginning of, when we started to settle the West. There was nothing out there but the individual. So that led people, of course, to the realization that I can't rely on anybody but myself. And so you have this, again, this national idea that has persisted and persisted because of that. And I'm not saying it should go away. Frankly, I agree with the idea of the individual. I don't like the idea of relying on other people. But other people have, ideas about that. And that could be heavily influenced by where I come from. Texas is a very, they call it an individualistic state because a lot of our, what's the word I'm looking for? Our governmental history was heavily influenced by the idea of the individual.
Mm-hmm.
I would just like to point out, just real quick, like, people who think that they don't rely on a community And then I just want to say, how many pairs of shoes that you wear have you made? How much of your clothing did you make? Did you build your house? What about the media you partake in? Like, did you make all this?
I'll put it this way. It could all go away, and I would still be just the same person I am now. Now, I've never made my own pair of shoes. That's a fact, because frankly, for the longest time, I wasn't able to make my own pair of shoes. I mean, the majority of my life, I'm 20 years old. There's probably been 5 years of that where I was mentally capable of creating my own shoes and such. But the idea isn't necessarily that I make everything I use. I am fully capable of making everything I need. It doesn't matter if you do or if you don't. It's a matter of if you are capable of doing it.
It was interesting that y'all be bringing up the nuclear family and the rise of it. Interestingly enough, I feel that I understand from the community standpoint how, it's the old saying, it takes a village to raise a child. That's definitely something I could see, because I know, like, when I was younger, like, my grandmother and my grandparents, they took care of me when my parents were unable to due to, them working, whatever. And I, relish having that opportunity. But I also think in today's America, the nuclear family has been some of it has been vilified in a sense, not directly. Nobody's outright calling for the death of the nuclear family, although some people are. But I think it's just more a cultural change has occurred to where there's less emphasis on the nuclear family. Because there's been a steady rise, especially in the African American community, of single parenthood that has come about since about the, I'd say, late 70s, early 80s. That wasn't there before.
I mean, I would argue that that's still like a subset of the nuclear family, because it's still built around this idea that you only live with your very immediate family. Like, you just have the parents or single parent or whatever, and then their children. You don't have, by and large, they're not looking to live with their brothers, their parents, their cousins, stuff like that. They're much more interested in living as isolated as they can, so they have their own space and etc. Like, I think it's detrimental overall.
I mean, I don't think it's an interest of single parent, because I know there's been lots of studies of single parenthood where they find that the children are more likely to join gangs or be criminals, and more likely not to get a college or high school education. Health is for those people they are less healthy than the standard population. I mean, just a number of issues because of the lack of not necessarily the lack of a two-parent household, because there could be multi-parent households, but it's just the lack of the structure and the support of a family that can support and raise the children. Yeah, in a more communal environment, the load would be lessened as you have a larger group of community people to take care of them. But I think that's a cultural change that we're not seeing. We're seeing the opposite to your point. We're seeing increased isolation because people are no longer getting married or getting in communities, but they're marrying the state, in a sense. But I think we've gone off topic quite a ways.
You know who looks really hot today? The state. Sorry, I just had to throw that one out there.
But as we did get off talking about families a bit, it does feed very directly into the state of the education system, because we touched on the fact that children who do not have as much support at home, obviously they don't do as well in school, and typically these sorts of communities, they don't see as much help from the government as they should either, and it just creates this this feedback loop where you're born into poverty and you basically inherit poverty from your family around you.
Mm-hmm. Me and Troop were actually talking about this in our last talk about the value of education and poverty itself. And studies were found that if a family, if your parents made less than collectively, I think it was less than about $36,000. Odds were, if you were in a poor family, you would be making your odds were like 45%. You'd be making less than them.
Mm-hmm.
Versus if your family made more than like 45,000, the odds were about 45% that you'd be making 80,000 plus as an adult. And the number one factor that changed that was your ability to get an education. For high school and college, both contributed wildly to an increase. Which is why I highly value education for that social and economic mobility. If I may get to my point, because I talked about the nature of poverty and the nature of funding schools and how that works. So this is actually a really interesting case study. So there is a school district in Nottoway, Virginia. It has about 2,000 students, just over 2,000. And a third of them are in poverty. So that means a third of those families make under the poverty line, which is 14,000 if you're single, and then like 20-something thousand if you're a parent. So very poor.
Yes.
For a family. And they receive from the federal government $775,000 of funding for 2,000 students, all the teachers and staff they need to provide food, all that good stuff. Versus Fairfax County, which is very close to them. They receive $20 million in federal funding, but they have a poverty rate of under 8%. But they have a much larger student body. Because
Yes.
part of how...
Oh, I'm sorry.
because part of how the funding works, like we discussed previously, it's based on the numbers. So you could go to school districts that, say, have 50% poverty rate. But, if they have, 3,000 students, that's small potatoes, versus a school district that has 20,000 students, and the same, 1,000 students are in poverty. Well, that's only 3%, but because the numbers are the same, and they have more students, they get more money.
Right.
The funding doesn't add up like how it should. Ideally, if you have a school district with a lot of students in poverty, that school district should get an extremely large amount of money versus one highly successful. But that's so interesting because even based upon the numbers like I just described, where the school in high poverty and very small got so little money, we actually spend about $115,000 per student. I think that's over the given education. And we get outcomes on par with the Slovak Republic, which only spends about $53,000 per student. Yeah.
A lot of the point that I would make with that is with our for-profit, like a lot of the people that provide to our schools are profit-seeking entities, and it's ridiculous. Like, for instance, textbooks. You have textbooks that have the exact same information, but because they changed a few pictures around, maybe moved a chapter, they can charge the exact same amount the book that they had last year, and it's like you have to have this one, otherwise everything's wrong.
Well, that's different for more college students because with schools, how schools generally do it is they buy textbooks and then they refresh them every 5 to 7 years. Probably shorter for more wealthier school district, but poor school districts, they can hold over their books for quite a while. But it's kind of interesting. So we rank out of 34 countries, 34 first world, very high-ranking nations. We rank 26 in math, 17 in reading, and 21 in science.
Out of how many?
It's
Out of how many?
out of 34 countries, based upon North
Oh.
America, Europe,
I see.
Australia, Japan, and I think South Korea.
I see. I thought I wasn't sure what the numbers meant for a second. I apologize. Sorry.
That's all right. So I mean, we outspend so many other countries, yet the results are so disparaging. When we rank less than half across the board of other countries in science, math, and reading, key subjects, that teach people how to read, how to analyze text, how to get those critical thinking and skills that you talk about. We rank so poorly, and I know some people are like, oh, you don't really use math. But math gives you a structure and a method of thinking to achieve a goal, I would say, to get an outcome.
Right. I'll put it this way, as far as math is concerned. Plato, in his book, The Republic, described, how do I put this? So basically, he was trying to create the ultimate city-state in his mind. And a lot of that had to do with this city-state teaching its children arithmetic because it increased the mind. You may not actually use the crap you learn in algebra, but what you're doing is expanding your mind. It's the same thing as, basically everything you could possibly think of. If you do it, properly, you can use it to expand your mind. But I think it's a mentality thing more than all. People sit there and say, for algebra or other maths in particular, well, you're never going to use this in your life. Well, that's true, but it's the same thing. Like, I'm never going to use, an arm curl in a fight. I'm not just going to walk up and hit you with an arm curl. You know what I mean? I'm not going to knock you out. But you're strengthening those muscles, making yourself more efficient at everything. So sorry to interrupt.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to listen to that on the Republic, and I'm like, this dude spends a lot of time talking about who he's going to kill.
Oh, Plato?
No, when they're talking about, what was it? What defines a friend, what defines an enemy, and what is objectively moral and what is objectively and stuff like that. I'm like, it's a lot of circular logic depending on this. This is a little, I followed it pretty well, but like the way, it's definitely a lot easier to absorb when you read it as opposed to listening to it.
Yeah. Well, I'll put it this way, as far as Plato was concerned, this man lived before Christ. As far as what he knew about the world around him, he didn't really know a whole lot. So he was going with what he knew, or at least trying. There's a lot of philosophers that over the years, people say, that doesn't make any sense. But at his time, he was doing what he could with what he had. But, that's kind of beside the point. But he hit the nail on the head when it came to education and such like that.
It's a foundation for those that came after it.
Right.
Furthermore, so it's kind of interesting. So looking at the education, the graduation rate. So in 2012, black students only had a 69% graduation rate. Hispanics had 73%. Asians had 88%, and Caucasian students had 86% graduation rate. So
Did you say Caucasian?
Yeah, Caucasian.
Oh, okay. I see.
So white people.
Yeah.
So, based upon those numbers alone, it's clear that, I would say a lot of the black community may have issues with, preparing people to graduate. Whether that's a cultural thing or, again, as we've discussed, a funding issue.
It could be a little bit of both because, being a child in a home where you have educated parents, you're going to be more driven to getting an education yourself because they're going to place emphasis on education, at least most of the time. Being in a home where, say, your parents didn't go to school or they don't have an education, you're not going to be as emphasized. So you're basically snowballing, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer in this case. If your parents don't have an education, you're less likely to have an education. And if they do, you're more likely to have an education. So I think that can at least help explain some of the, those gaps that are starting to show.
I just love it when people try to explain that, well, wealth can be inherited, but apparently poverty cannot be inherited, and it's like,
Oh no, poverty can definitely be inherited. Sorry to interrupt.
no, it's fine. That's pretty much the entire point. It's like, that's exactly how it works. If you have parents that had nothing by the time you're an adult, you literally are starting from nothing.
I wouldn't say you inherit poverty or wealth. I would say more than anything, you inherit the willingness and the ability to become educated. You know what I mean? You inherit that drive, and that drive is what leads you to be more well off, or obviously a lack thereof leads people to go work at, the gas station ad infinitum.
I mean, there are people who have come from poverty and ended up, being surgeons and doctors and senators and shit. I mean, it's possible to break the cycle of poverty. I just think the barrier to do so is infinitely more higher. Because, whenever you're a kid and you're living in poverty and you have to worry about where your next meal's coming from, do you have electricity? Is your house going to be, is your mother going to be there, father going to be there the next day? When you have to worry about that as a child, you don't have time to think about, oh, I should really go get an education and try and focus on... No, you're thinking about, I'm just trying to survive and make it to the next day. I don't know.
I totally agree with that.
The cycle can be broken. You hear about people that do that all the time. I would say, of course, it is less likely. Again, because you're spending your entire time around people who are uneducated or who at least have a lower likelihood of being educated. And that has a deep influence on children. Children, they imitate those around them, or at least certain people around them. And of course, if the people they're imitating don't have an education, if they're in gangs, if they're criminals, of course, they're going to be the aforementioned, or at least be like them.
Yeah.
They need to have those good positive influences. And of course, the public education system can provide those good positive influences. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily their responsibility to, be the end all for positive influences in children's lives. I understand you have this group of people that's poor and becoming increasingly poor. The gap is widening. But is that really the school system or the federal government's place to step in there and say, hey, all the people around you are pretty shitty. Here's some good people. Come hang out with them.
As long as they continue to, encourage situations where, they perpetuate these negative situations for students, I would say, yeah, it is probably their responsibility to fix that.
Part of that is, excuse me, it's a history of poverty, and it's difficult to break out of. Because whenever you come from a community, like your grandmother has been poor and she was uneducated and didn't know anything, and then your mother was, poor and working, to the bone for, 60-hour work weeks just trying to put food on the table. And then when you're, don't really have anybody to help you, it's like, oh, you're struggling in school. Well, your mother's out working her night job after she just got home from her day job, and your father's who knows where, so you don't have, anybody to help you with that. There's not much that can be done. You can try and buckle down yourself, but when you don't understand the material, you're never going to be able to get it. Now, do I think there's a responsibility of the government to assist? I could definitely see that. It could be argued that there is a responsibility to provide students in some measure, whether that's role models, kind of like the Big Brother Big Sister program, or increased community outreach within these poor communities, WIC and food stamps, chips for healthcare. There's definitely things that could be done to improve the state of and the quality of lives that these children live in, which would then contribute to them being able to focus on improving themselves and their education capabilities.
See, and this has a lot to do with what you think the government's role in our society ought to be. You have the differing views therein, that the government should do X, Y, and Z, or they should do all of the letters above. And that, again, also has a lot to do with where you come from. Here in Texas, people tend to have a very minimalistic view of what the
I mean,
government should do.
I was raised in Texas, so
Right. No, and I'm not saying this is always true for every person. I'm merely saying
Yeah.
it's very common. This is typically what people think. Coming from this region. Our governmental tradition, as it used to call it in my textbook, was one of basically governmental minimalism.
hmm And it's a bit more of a separatist versus a collectivist ideas. I'm for both. Well, both ideas. They both have their merits and places of use.
Mm-hmm.
We can't survive with one or the other. If we were all individuals, we would never be able to collectively come together to do anything cohesively.
Right.
And if we're all collective, then issues would never be able to be dealt with on a personal level. So, I don't know, how's everybody feeling about education? I think we've cut to the heart of it, eh?
I feel great.
Asimov?
Nom, nom.
So let's do a quick summary on our points and how we feel, if they may have changed or anything. So, for me, my point is, as I've described, that poverty and financial funding for schools is the number one factor in the declining quality of education, and that to change that, we need to change how we fund schools and provide funding based on needs more directly than how we do now, so that way schools can fund educators and teachers' assistants and aides and such to benefit the students in getting an education and increasing the quality of it.
Okay.
Trooper?
Again, my major problem with the education system, I think the collective mentality of what the education system ought to be. I think it ought to be a place where people go and they expand their minds. Basically, they become better individuals. Of course, if the federal government or the state governments are not spending enough money in a particular school that needs that type of funding, what are you going to do? They need that in order to effectively grow and educate these children. I've lost my train of thought. So I guess I'll end it there.
Well, mine is, it's a combination of those 2 points. The system is completely screwed. It's not meeting the needs of the people that are going through it. We pay so much money. Obviously, all the time, most of the taxes we pay don't go towards schooling, but still a ridiculously impressive amount of money goes into our school system, and yet we still keep getting substandard results because funding doesn't go to where it needs to go. It tends to focus on students who are already poised to achieve because those parents have the ability to get the attention of schools to say, hey, we need this here, we need this now, this is where the money should be going, and they can't hear alternate points to that because the parents who actually need the money can't even bother to show up because they're too busy trying to keep a roof over their head. So we absolutely need a better allocation of the funds. We need to stop focusing so much on the memorization of facts and little factoids, and especially I feel we need to, with a lot of books, we need to stop the misrepresentation of history. Is another big problem I see with our education system. Is we have. I remember going through school. I had to take U.S. history like 5 different times in different years because apparently that's the only history that matters. And then we'd take world history, and that's just like a packet on in some class in high school, where like, oh, this was Mesopotamia, this was Greece, this was Rome, and this is there's the Mongols, and now we're here. And it's like, well, that you got to spend fucking 3 months on the entire world history, but we get several years of just learning about how great our country is. Like it's complete bullshit. We need to move away from just teaching kids things and teaching them how to appreciate learning and how to disassemble thoughts within society, how to critically think and figure out things for themselves, not necessarily because we should expect them all to be by themselves, but because many people who are able to disassemble problems and working together to fix these problems, we're going to see much better results.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, I would say we've covered that fairly thoroughly.
I would like to raise one evocative question before we end this segment, or provocative question, excuse me. If a rock is falling down a hill, should you push it or should you stop this rock? Now, the rock in question is those lower people who are already failing within the education system. So my question is this: is it actually good for us as a collective country, better for us as a whole, to take away from the people already succeeding and give it to the people who aren't succeeding? Or would it be better to finish the job, take away from the people who aren't succeeding and give it to the people who are succeeding so that they can achieve even more?
I think the people that are succeeding have already succeeded enough. I mean, we've already got a system where, 8 Americans own more wealth than fucking 50% of the entire world? Like, how much more success do we need from these people? And others like them. Like, it's complete bullshit. Especially when a lot of these divisive lines as to who's failing and who isn't are largely based upon race. It's completely counter to the ideals that this country were supposedly founded upon.
Mm-hmm. And it definitely points to, like, inner city schools, a lot of inner city schools are very poor, they're very struggling, they have, there's high crime rates in the area and such. But if you fund the schools, if you, can get, teachers, and if you can improve the quality of the students, if you can improve the students, you will improve the neighborhood. It won't be quick, it won't be simple, it's not a quick fix, it is a very long-term plan, because that's where it has to start from. You have to improve the students, you have to improve the populace of the area to bring everybody up, rising tide, rising tide rises all boats, Because if you give kids if you can teach kids and give them the critical skills to educate themselves and to learn, so that way they can see, well, a gang isn't my only option, or poverty's not my only option. I can actually go and become successful. And if you did that for a generation of kids, you would rise this nation's profile so high. And that starts with struggling kids.
Like, just look as an analogy, as a sort of a example of this is the first implementation of the modern school system. We didn't see gains from it right immediately. However, as soon as we started teaching absolutely everybody in the country, that's when our economy really started to take off. We were one of the first to do it, and we were definitely one of the largest populations to actually commit to teaching everybody in our society, and we absolutely benefited from it. Like, we went from a pretty strong country to a completely dominant force within the world for the next 100 years. Like it's almost embarrassing how much power we gained from educating everybody in our society.
Well, leveling the entirety of Europe, and stealing all their shit kind of helped too.
I would say we stole far more from Africa than Europe.
Okay. No, I definitely.
I'll put it this way:
education,
II, the U.S. had like 80-something%, 90-something% of the U.S. or the world's gold bullion, from Europe.
We can cover history in a later debate, folks. Although it does sound rather interesting.
Well, I'm just saying I don't think it was necessarily. I would say it's not just because we started teaching people, but again, I do think our economic impact, our economic stance had a lot to do with the fact that we came out on top after World War II.
It was probably a twofold event: having the money necessary to be able to afford to fund the populace.
Part of that definitely had to do with the fact that we just have so much landmass too.
Yeah, I mean we're filled with natural resources out the ass.
Yeah, we still stole
We can discuss that
them. Yeah, that's
in
fine.
a later topic. That's definitely not controversial.
Yes.
It's a given, but it it's something that'll throw us off. So I think we got a lot out of that. I mean, we definitely got our all points across, and I would say ultimately, part of it's funding, part of it's critical thinking skills and collectivist education versus individualist education and such, and the merits of both, and ultimately improving a generation of students with the skills needed to critically think, analyze, and improve would ultimately benefit the nation overall.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, would anybody care to take a break or anything before we move on to the next topic?
I would, if that's not such a big bother. I need to go grab something to wet my whistle. I'll be right back.
Feel free.
I too will take just a brief minute break and get something to drink. All right, I'm back. Stripper back.
Haven't heard him.
All right. So, Asmov, how are you feeling about our talk so far?
I'm feeling pretty good.
Okay, I apologize for that momentary.
You should.
I am definitely not that sorry, but I'm a little apologetic. Apologetic? Yes, I'm apologetic. Whatever the hell that means.
Gotta smoke that ganja.
Mm-hmm.
Not that we get anything in Texas. Quote unquote.
Oh, it's unfortunate.
All right.
I mean, I live up in Washington, so everybody.
God damn you.
Everybody's like, "Hey, let's just do whatever."
Alright, so if everybody's ready, I'll move on to the next topic.
See?
Okay, so next in our rather interesting discussion is the school-to-prison pipeline, its origins, its causes and effects, and what it ultimately is leading to.
Okay.
So, to start us off, I will give the dictionary definition for the audience's sake. So the United States school-to-prison link, or school-to-prison pipeline, is a metaphor to describe the increasing patterns of contact students have with the juvenile and adult criminal justice systems as a result of recent practices implemented by educational institutions and zero-tolerance policies and the use of these policies in school.
All right.
Trooper, would you care to take us off on this?
Not really, but I will.
I mean, I'm definitely more prepared.
To be honest with you guys, I've never heard of the school to prison pipeline before. Oh hell, what was that, last weekend or whenever we decided we were going to do this conversation? I generally never heard of it, never seen it on the news, never read about it. Just wasn't on my mind. But after reading about it a little bit, I have noticed that there is something to the idea that more school-age people, more high school age individuals are ending up in prisons. Well, why is that? According to the information I've seen, it is because of zero-tolerance policies and the police presence within public schools. Okay, now zero-tolerance policies are, as we all know, pretty much across the board to deal with violence and drugs and such like that, or at least that's why they were originally implemented. But there's an issue with the zero tolerance policy, and that is that the person who has issues enough that they are, bringing drugs to school or bringing guns or what have you, when they're kicked out of school, they lose the environment which allows them to become, I don't want to say a better person, but to basically change and be a different type of person. They're probably involved in those things because the society they're around is involved in those things, drugs and guns and all that. Bears oh my. But, when you kick them out of school, all you're doing is basically thrusting that individual into that societal group even further. You're not helping them in any way. Now, what you are doing on the plus side of this is you are, quote unquote, protecting the individuals who are not already within that society. Now, whether or not the protection for the people not within that group warrants, the people getting kicked out of it is up for debate.
Asimov?
So basically my whole point, it revolves around the fact that we, it starts off pretty young, honestly, with the advent of out of school suspensions. I think I read back in the mid to late 70s, only about 4% of students were actually given out of school suspensions. And I mean, it starts really early. There's a definite there's a bias within our country that tends to see children of color, primarily black children, as being a lot more mature than they actually are. Obviously, this is also seen in the criminal justice system by a lot of minors getting, tried as adults. Even though they're 14 years old, they're saying, well, he's a pretty big guy. Obviously, he deserves to be tried as an adult. And it's just this whole system where we see these kids as being more culpable in their actions, and so what happens is they're held to a higher standard by their in their behaviors, and they are subsequently punished at a higher rate and to a higher degree than white students typically are. And so what this does is it just again, it's another feedback loop where you have students who are removed from these situations, and they are removed from positive influences in their life, and they're left to their own devices, more or less. And this just leads them to continue negative behavior until eventually they just end up in prison.
Hmm.
Yeah, no, that's definitely what can be found with zero tolerance being the rise, and I know some people like to say zero tolerance, zero thought. Increasingly, more and more policies of schools are being pushed under zero tolerance, not due to the government outlining it, but due to the schools themselves. Originally, zero tolerance rose from a lot of the gun and drug violence in the 90s, which basically said if there was which put into place the policy that if drugs or guns were found, was either, an instant suspension or expulsion. But more and more schools, as time has progressed, increased in adding different punishments, variety of things. If it looks like a gun, if it looks like a weapon, it could be made out of plastic, it could be just a simple toy, it could just be the suggestion of it. And, well, that's enough to hit off their zero tolerance, parameters, and, well, there you go. You got a kid suspended now. Because I know there are some cases of... So I have a case right here. It is the case of a first grader, a 6th grade first grader in the Delaware school system, who brought a combination fork, knife, spoon, like you find like a mess kit for like camping and such.
Yeah, Swiss Army knife.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Sort of, yes. And he was suspended and was threatened to be sent to a correctional school for juveniles because the school felt that the knife was a dangerous weapon, and then under the zero tolerance policies, well, that's the appropriate prescription.
Whereas, if I may bring forth one example, one personal example of my own, I actually did bring a pocket knife to school once. One of my teachers saw me with it, and I got suspended for a day, and they confiscated it, and that was the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it wasn't even the next day. They just sent me home and told me to come back tomorrow, basically.
So I would share with you my personal stories regarding this particular topic, but I can't say it on stream because, well, I mean, it's that bad.
It's a gag order.
Well, sort of.
You sold military secrets.
Not necessarily military secrets, but I said some such and did some such that I can't really, talk about on stream because of Twitch's TOS. But it could be said.
Didn't you talk about it on stream earlier?
I
think you
sure.
discussed it.
I may have. Anyway, so I'll just go ahead and say it then. I mean, it's your stream. If you don't want me to say it, I won't say it. But anyway.
It's fine by me. It's a part of the talk.
So when I was in the 2nd grade, I had Black History Month was going on. It was February. I was in the 2nd grade. I had a teacher talking about how, Black history was this and that. And I remember asking the teacher, why is Black history such a big deal? Why the hell do they have a whole month? We should just go out there and shoot them all. And I actually almost got expelled from school just for that one.
Wait, did you say we should go and shoot them all?
Yes. And I was like 8 years old, obviously. I mean, what? Yeah, an 8-year-old's going to go shoot everybody. But that's not the point. I almost got expelled from school. The only thing that kept me out of getting expelled from public school for that particular outburst was my father's idea of writing and delivering an apology letter to the entire group. So I would say that, it's not necessarily just a black people have it harder deal, but everybody, at least in my experience, because I'm not black, everybody is struck with this. If you even mention anything violent or anything like that, they just lose their shit. And even when you're a child, I mean, you're 8 years old. What is it? What the hell's an 8-year-old going to do? But, that's my personal experience with this particular subject.
Yeah, that can definitely be seen as a direct threat to people. So the school, based under zero tolerance, I'm surprised you didn't get suspended or sent to an alternative school. Because from everything I've seen, like, they would do that for less than what you said.
I was also in small town Texas. I don't know. Who knows what the true cause of me not getting expelled was? Maybe the principal liked my mom. I don't know. But the point is that yes, these particular policies aren't necessarily the best. I would say they're rather illogical because again, what the heck is one of those children gonna do? You have a 1-year-old that brings a fork and a knife and a spoon to class. Okay, what danger is that? You have a person that says, something aggressive about a particular type of individual. What danger are they? They're children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's definitely the case where schools themselves have been pushed to increase policies. Part of it is from the federal government, but also part of it is from their own local, their own localities. Like, well, if we can just push it off under zero tolerance, we don't got to worry about it. We don't got to, check the nuance of it or put any thought into it. It is just one prescription for all things, and nobody wins out of it. But it's definitely a dangerous thing for sure. Let's see. Yeah, because I have right here. So, 40% of the students expelled from U.S. schools each year are black. 70% of in-school arrests by law enforcement are Latino or black.
I have that infograph open too.
And and I'll just go skip to this. So 60% of males in state and federal prisons don't have a high school diploma.
Is this on PBS? Because I think I have the same thing open.
We're all looking at the same thing.
Yeah, definitely one of the more telling ones, I think, which kind of circles back a little bit to the previous point that we had, is that 70% of inmates in California, for example, are former foster care children.
Mm-hmm.
Like it just goes to show that you don't have have people at home that help you, and especially you're not getting any help from the school. Like obviously, where else are they going to put these people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in our next issue, I'm definitely going to talk about how the government more or less incentivizes this behavior. But that's definitely an issue to go on in a little bit later.
Yeah.
So I think, when I look at this data, and I hate to cut you off, Kenneth, but when I look at this data, I don't see discrimination. What I see is the proof that your raising has so much influence on who you will become. I see, twice as many blacks and Latino students. Black and Latino students are twice as likely to not graduate high school as whites. That would make me question, what kind of community are you in? What kind of emphasis does it place on education? How well educated are the people you surround yourself with? And now these children don't have a choice. They're 8 years old, 9 years old, and so forth. They don't get to choose, well, you guys are idiots. I don't want to hang out with you. You can't. But it makes me question how these communities are focused. What are they focused on? As we've talked about before, they're probably not focused on education. So, what can you do to deal with the community issue? And then, in my mind, the number of people from that community actually graduating high school would increase.
Yeah, but here's some startling statistics. So from St. Louis, Missouri, the Normandy School District's 98% black student population showed the following results. 100% of all students received more than one out-of-school suspension. 100% of those who were expelled without educational services, and 100% of those who were referred to law enforcement. So think that damn near an entire school district's population was suspended at least once, was expelled at least once, and was referred to law enforcement at least once.
It's just the whole system is designed to round up and basically anybody who's not white into these sort of areas that have been deprived of the same tools and the same access to opportunity, to anything that resembles anything that could help these people, so that we can give them to ourselves.
I love robbing from the rich. Or not the rich, I'm sorry, the poor.
So
I love
you
robbing
love-
from everybody.
you
All of
love-
my ancestors just loves taking other people's shit. It's what we did best.
You love the Reagan model: steal from the poor and give to the rich.
I don't care if I give it to the rich. Just give it to me. Fuck the rich.
Nah, man, trickle down economics. It totally works.
They don't use that money to make a bigger cup. That doesn't happen ever.
Nah, trickle down, they're just pissing on you.
I love golden showers, especially when it's made of gold bullion.
I think that it hurts.
Nah, dude. Like, I would be alright with the pain. If you're pissing gold on me, I'd be okay with the pain. I'd be like, bring it on, man.
But I think the important question here is it gold bullion or is it liquid gold?
Is it liquid gold Velveeta cheese?
No, I would say it's melted.
I'm sorry, I just recently saw that commercial.
Anyways, this is another interesting one. So it says in 2009, a West Valley school district in Spokane, Washington, expelled 20% black students and 60% white students and offered no educational services. Of those who were expelled, 10% of black students and 60% of white students were done under zero-tolerance policies. Those who were referred to law enforcement included 10% black and 80% of white students. However, the Spokane School District has reported a higher number of white students enrolled, at 86% white, 4% black students. So, proportionally, black students are getting referred more to police and being removed under zero-tolerance policies than white students. But I think...
Go ahead.
Sorry. But looking at these statistics alone, and looking at all these numbers, unfortunately, isn't enough to develop a solid basis for why this is happening. Because ultimately, in my opinion, I think a lot of this is cultural influences that's affecting these students, whether that's, the neighborhoods, their family, their support or lack thereof, which can happen in any given area. But I think that presents part of these expulsions and suspensions under these zero-tolerance policies is the culture and the behavior of these students.
And I just point out that it is absolutely an issue of poverty. Obviously there is issues of racism and on things like that. However, I would say that a lot of it is definitely born down the lines of, we have the wealthy and the affluent against the poor and who they see as undeserving. Because even in communities where there's a heavily white population where things like this happen, it's always in impoverished areas that do not have access to the same opportunities. And it's completely telling that the baseline for this whole system is built around disenfranchising groups that already don't have as much as anybody else. We stiff the poor because we say, oh, hey, why should we bother with these people? They're already down there. What's a little bit less going to be to them? and then on top of that, we have this tendency to group racial minorities as well into those areas that are traditionally poor. For instance, a lot of the northern areas that were poor were filled with the Irish and Jewish populations before they were filled with any other ethnic minorities. It's an example that we that's just what the ruling class tends to do, is that they deny certain people the same access to the tools that they got to get to where they are, and then you frame this whole thing from the individualist standpoint of each person is ultimately in charge of their own selves, and thus by framing it in this way you completely ignore the ongoing socioeconomic issues that plague these people. They're, I would say, are the main reasons why we have these issues in the first place.
Damn those individualists. I bet they did 9/11 too.
They probably did. They gotta start a war in the Middle East somehow.
It was all a false flag. The government Bush did 9/11.
The government Bush did 9/11? The government's Bush did it?
The government's Bush.
Yeah, the government's Bush, yep. The hedges in the White House, they did 9/11.
Oh, shit, that's funny.
So, Tripper, would you care to respond?
Oh, good lord. Yeah, where to begin? Give me just a second while I formulate this. So, I think there's obviously the plausibility that, it's plausible that the people in power would want to keep other people from becoming powerful themselves. I mean, it's very simple.
It's in their own best interest.
Yes. However, I would also say that the people in power have no responsibility necessarily to help the people who aren't in power. So we may say, it's evil. You're a terrible human being because you don't want to, help X, Y, and Z because they're disenfranchised. I would then ask the question, are they actually responsible for helping these individuals at any point in anything? Because the only responsibility that they have truly is to themselves and their own. That is the only responsibility a human creature ever has beyond what, society would say, well, we've decided that you're responsible for X, Y, and Z.
Well,
on a base level.
But as we discussed last week, society's will is the interpretation of the individual through liaisons that implement and develop it. So by our own measure, as we discussed, the will of society in today's age is to support and increase the general welfare of all Americans.
Right, that is the trend that society has been moving to. Now, I would argue against that because, frankly, not because I'm rich, because I'm a poor white man, merely because I don't think that's actually the government's role in society. I don't think that ought to be the government's role in society, is to be that entity which constantly makes things better for the disenfranchised. I don't think it necessarily is its responsibility to do that. Now, we can make it its responsibility, but I don't think that's necessarily its responsibility. But to move on to the further point. Now, you could say that, the powerful are those that are keeping down, the disenfranchised, the ethnic minorities. I would say, because as I look at these statistics, again, I see, Black students are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended than whites. I would ask the question, are these suspensions the responsibility of the individual? And then what's causing these? I've never seen a white man walking around a black neighborhood saying, no, dude, you cannot make yourself a better human being. You can't become more educated. You can't do anything like that. Now, again, I would say, I understand your point that that the wealthy and the powerful are using their socioeconomic impact to keep those people disenfranchised. Well, whether or not that's true is debatable. I would beg the question, does it... Oh, let me actually reformat that. Give me one moment. Every person is responsible for their own actions. Yes, if the individual is not driven to become more educated, to be, better than their ancestors, to be better than X, is that necessarily indicative of the man keeping them down? Or does that, I don't want to say prove, but does that merely show that this individual's raising, their personality, their whatever, is causing them to eschew those advantages that another person might push for? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, because of your raising, you might be more or less driven.
I mean, I definitely see what you're saying. And the actions of the individual are of the individual.
Right.
But when the system is broken, when the system is corrupt and doesn't allow logic and sensibility, critical thought to be placed in, nuances, it limits that culpability of the individual. Because, I mean, if I go, if I was...
basically, it limits the scope of what is available to them, and so they are more or less stuck acting within a certain frame of what is actually available to them in ways that they can react.
Exactly. And with a structure like that, you almost don't have a choice in how you react as an administrator, or what you can do for the student. Because if the student does X, you can only react in one way. If there's no, thought of nuance, or we'll interpret it this way, or you did this because of X, well, then that can only lead to one outcome, which is suspension, expulsion, the lack of a continuing education, the increase of likelihood of going to prison, becoming a criminal, not being able to better yourself. I mean, it all stems from a lack of care and nuance in these policies. Because before, if you got into a fight with another person, they'd ask you, like, okay, well, why did you get into this fight? Well, I was defending the other person because the one person was beating them up. And then they'd be sure, that's a extenuating circumstance. So I'll probably have to, give you with a lighter sentence or a warning or something. And that other person will get the harsher sentence. But in the zero tolerance, it's just like, oh, you were fighting? I don't care why you were fighting, you were just fighting. That's right, you're both getting equal suspension. Or expulsion. So, whenever people see that, whenever people see the injustice at a small scale, especially when it directly affects themselves, that places upon their mind, that's how life is set up. Life will never give them any nuance. Life will never give them any chances. Life is just, we're going to prescribe this one set without care or thought, and thus forth, it is how it is. So, I mean, in my opinion, and based upon the studies that we have, zero tolerance policies lead to less desirable outcomes across the board. It leads to an increase in poverty, an increase in prison population. It leads to a decrease in people getting educated. It leads to people becoming distrustful of the education system. I mean, a number of, negatives. I mean, this entire policy is a negative policy. And it truly does stem from zero tolerance.
And it's also another thing to say that, you can't see the forest from the trees, in that you might not be aware that there are other options to certain situations, but to people like us who can dispassionately look at the system from the outside, we can say, oh, hey, you could have done this, you could have done this. Well, they don't have that same reference as we do. That's very much a privilege that we have that they just don't. So I always find it's best to do your best to approach issues from a frame of reference of the people that are going through it first and foremost, before anything else. You try to see it from those people's perspectives, from the people who are actually, being hurt by these policies, by these by these economic realities that they face.
Hmm.
And I mean, we can go on and talk all day about how, you know, there's all sorts of just casual racism in the workplace. You know, for yeah, if we're going to talk about how the lack of education or the lack of uh, viable employment are hurting, you know, minority groups. We can talk about how, you know, people that don't have white sounding names are likely to just have their resume tossed, or we can talk about how, you know, they are automatically seen as more culpable in their actions. Even, you know, like I said, even as a child, they're seen as being more mature than they actually are. You know, there's a lot going on here, and it's all geared towards, you know, maintaining one group as superior over the others.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's true.
And whether or not people actively and knowingly engage in this, or whether or not they simply act and engage with it because that's what they know and that's what they understand, that's what I feel is something that's debatable. um, you know, you have people who do certain things not because they're evil people, or because, you know, they think that they deserve more than, you know, other people do, but because that's how they've been raised and that's how they understand the world, and they haven't been challenged in a way that allows them to think outside of their own experience. And that's another thing that I think we need more of, is just the ability to think outside of our own experience.
Hmm. Now,
I
I would
guess
ask this question because it appears as though race and economic ability, or at least in this discussion, linked. I wouldn't say that, you know, minorities are necessarily held down because they are X, Y, or Z. As a matter of fact, in my personal experience, and actually a minute ago, I was looking at educational statistics. Minorities tend to be preferred to white folk, if you want to call it that, in regards to, at least in my experience, jobs. And I had a list just a minute ago. I could pull it back up, but I'm not going to, of a variety of higher educational institutions which practice affirmative action and actually enroll a noticeably higher percentage of minority students than white students. Now, I don't care about what color a person is. I care about what you can do and who you are. If a person is black and they are more intelligent than, you know, a white person, I would say, okay, that person's more intelligent. It takes nothing away from them and it adds nothing to that they are black and that they are Hispanic or whatever, white. But I would I would state that the idea that a person has intrinsic privileges because they are white, you know, any other race truly, you know, is foolish, because that is not necessarily true for every person of that race. You know, just as you can't profile one black person, you know, for the actions of another necessarily. You know, you can't hold all white people to the same standards and say that all white people have privilege or all white people, you know, do this or do that, the same way you can't do that with any other minority. Now, I'm not going to say that there aren't certain people that have, you know, received privileged benefits, but I don't think that necessarily has to do with the fact that they have white names or black names or Hispanic names, because I've seen just as many people get jobs merely because they had black names and Hispanic names and because that company had a quota to fill.
See, and that's where a lot of the issue I feel with the worldview there kind of comes from. It's because you're basing everything from your own experience. You're not working with, you know, the detailed statistics of the reality of the world that we live in. You know,
yes, but your mind is subjective. You know, you can't view it in objective situations.
Yes, but you can look at information that tells you certain things that are happening. You know, like for instance, with police violence, you know, or just at the incarceration rate for drug offenses. Although minorities are at no higher risk, or no, they do not use illegal drugs at a noticeably or significantly or even statistically higher rate than whites do, they are incarcerated. I think it's like 1.5 times more than white individuals are for the same crimes. It's, this is just one small example of this. There's all sorts, there's just tons of data about housing discrimination, about job discrimination, about bank discrimination, people getting denied loans because they're not seen as, as capable, just because of the color of the skin or because of their name. And it's a huge issue in this country. And if you stick too much on framing on what you personally have experienced, you lose out on a lot of other experience, a lot of other viewpoints that actually have gone through things in different states. For example, as far as I know, you've only experienced this in Texas. Whereas there's a whole extra country out there. There's a lot more country out there. And I say this as somebody who used to think the exact same way as you do. I had almost the exact same idea back in high school. I thought that minorities had it easy, that women had it easy because they have all these special privileges. But it's, at the end of the day, who are they getting these privileges from? They're not getting them from themselves. They're getting them from the people who are in power, which is by and large us. And these programs and all these methods and things that we're trying to help these minority groups with are a result of just an attempt to balance out how poorly we've been treating these groups for many, many, many years. We are celebrating Independence Day right now, where we're celebrating freedom, and it's like, okay, well, freedom for who? The slaves weren't free. They certainly don't have a reason to celebrate the 4th of July.
But who was slaves? Who alive today was slaves? I mean, I understand your points. I mean, definitely whites and blacks use marijuana at the same rates, but blacks get arrested and convicted more often than whites. It's definitely a problem in how we do policing. You are indeed correct again on the point of names and how black-sounding names are less likely to get jobs or loans or anything like that, are found to be more suspicious. I mean, everything you said statistically is not incorrect. It definitely leads to a much more broader culture in America, and there are thoughts on it. I've lost my train of thought.
Spent too much time around me.
But I was going to talk about affirmative action. But I think affirmative action has had its place, in my opinion. It was needed. All these certain programs were definitely needed to improve the standings of people who were oppressed by the government and by society for many hundreds of years. So there was a place for it, in my opinion, on the affirmative action front. It's time to go. We should be looking more as a meritocracy-based society. Mm-hmm. You put the work in, you show the results, you get the reward, kind of thing. For the hiring practices, they could easily just remove their names, identifying features, and well, you don't really have much to go off outside of the results.
There's actually, not to totally cut you off here, but there is actually one case where they did this, and the results were really interesting. There was an orchestra, I forget which one it is, but what they did is they started holding blind auditions behind a curtain. People would just play. They'd walk in, they'd play, because they had an issue where it was primarily men getting these positions. That the orchestra was by and large just men. So they started doing blind auditions, but it didn't change at first. So like they were still hiring men at the same rate. So, but what they ended up doing is they realized one small thing needed to be changed. So what they did is instead of it being a hardwood floor, they changed it to carpeting, and then suddenly the rates were completely neutral. They started hiring men and women at the exact same rate, and this is, I feel, a really good example of how ridiculously nuanced and how minuscule little things can severely impact how we view the world around us. Simply by the fact that they could hear heels clicking on the ground made them less likely to want to hire this person that was playing. It's absolutely insane.
That's rather interesting. Um, but yeah, I mean, as I was saying, there are things that could be done to change the circumstances. Because, I mean, realistically, if you looked at removing affirmative action, what you would end up with for colleges that have done this, they've actually ended up with a large Asian population at their schools. Because there's a culture of extremely hard work ethic and rigorous improvement that they found that there's actually been a very sharp uptick. Whereas before with affirmative action, they only needed to get, a certain number of this, and this for the college. Well, now they're saying we're getting a large influx of, certain people because of the grades and the merit that they've shown. I mean, in my opinion, if we got rid of affirmative action and, we did certain things to more eliminate bias in hiring and firing and, variety of things by different methods, removing names or carpet or whatever, I think we would find a more merit-based society would be better for everybody. It would impress upon people the ethics to succeed and to improve yourself regardless of who you are and how you look. Because, you're going to get that fair shot at getting that job or getting into that college based upon your work ethic and such, not based upon, well, you're this race and we in our company has to hire, 7 of you by tomorrow or else we're going to get fined, or, oh, you fit this race category or this certain fixture, well, we can get you in, kind of thing. I think there are things and methods that could be used to balance practices that are unfair to everybody.
I agree with you in this regard, Kenneth, because I do think that the only proper way to hire somebody is based on merit. Whether your sex should not matter, your race should not matter, your name should not matter. What matters is whether or not you can do the job better than everybody else who applied. I think that is the only reliable way for a company to hire individuals, or the only proper way, or, you could call it just, but I wouldn't call it just. I agree with you in this regard. I think it's actually silly that, a company has a quote unquote quota of individuals of a particular race that they have to hire, or, that they have to have employed at one particular time. I think that's, you took racism where they were excluding people of a race, and then you just took it to the opposite. The opposite. Sorry. You made it basically positive racism, which is still racism.
Yeah, I agree that the specifics of affirmative action are not good. And I agree. In an ideal society, we should be doing things purely on merit. Unfortunately, without these programs, the reality of the situation is that these people are going to be looked over in favor of more traditional sounding names, more more straight white men are going to be hired because that's what people view as that's what they want to see. It's not outside of their it's not outside of themselves. They can, they see themselves in these people, and they're like, okay, yeah, I know what I'm going to expect with these, with somebody like this. And that's the whole reason why we started affirmative action in the first place, was because companies were refusing to hire women and minorities, and so they had to enforce quotas to basically give them tax breaks for meeting these quotas. Again, I do think that we should not. I don't think that we should have affirmative action, but until the playing field itself is level, we need them to make some sort of show that we got to do something, and clearly, to the people at top saying you need to do this, you just need to hire this many of this type, and that fixes the problem. It's like, that doesn't fix the problem. It's like a band-aid solution at best.
Because
and the only other thing I was going to add is that even as many people as it helps, it also ends up hurting, because now you have other groups that say, oh, well, this is preferential treatment, and it's like, it's kind of like that quote, if you stab a knife 6 inches into my back and pull it 3 inches out, that's not progress.
I mean, I can definitely see what you're talking about, and like I said, I agree. Things need to be done, the structures need to be changed to allow that, and I think policies on the federal and state level need to be implemented to institute such things. Blind auditions, removing names, identifying markers and such has to be implemented to level the playing field. Because if I'm applying for a job and a black person's applying for a job and they're infinitely more qualified than I am, well, they should get the job. That's just how that should work. If because my name is Kenneth and it's a traditionally white-sounding name, but I happen to get the job, I wouldn't know that, but the hirer would. And if I found that, I would obviously think that'd be unfair.
And sometimes, keep going.
Because in my opinion, when I look for people to hire, I want people more qualified than myself, because I want somebody who's going to be able to actually know their shit. Because I know some people's like, we don't want to hire people, smarter than I am, or smarter than they are, essentially, so that way they're always on top. But part of the over political correctness leads to places like, I think it's Switzerland, or no, not Switzerland, like Denmark, where they're basically saying all companies that hire over a certain amount of people and have a board must be 50% men, 50% women by like 2020. So then that leads to a sexist affirmative action where they're going to have to fire people on the board, if they're men, to open up spots for women. And I think that's a major overcorrection of a system.
See, and what I would say in response to this is that, well, yeah, it's kind of bullshit to get rid of people just so that they can bring in somebody new. I would also point out, this is kind of a side point that would be a different issue entirely. But, a lot of this stems, like a lot of with employment and all that, it stems from the issue that we require employment to the degree that we require it in today's society, where, with automation and all this other stuff, we can meet the needs of the entire global population, and all we would need is more implementation of automation and a more capable logistics system, and we would definitely see a lot of improvements. It's just where it's another issue of where we're stuck in the past and we can't move forward.
Okay, I think we've gone wildly off topic in the past.
Yeah, right.
30 minutes talking about employment and such. But I mean, to summarize things, I mean, from my perspective, I would say the ultimate key factor in the school-to-prison pipeline is the increasing prominence of zero tolerance and the lack of nuance in implementation and such, which leads to increased sentencing of suspensions and such, which increases students' free time and likelihood of joining gangs or committing crimes, as well as the increasing police force on site to instantly give citations or arrests of students, which ultimately then gives them a criminal record, increasing the likelihood that they will commit major crimes and go to prison. Would anybody have anything to add to that?
No, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head.
That basically, we need to frame, we need to recognize that we need to offer more. It's pretty much the same issue as last time. We just need more opportunity, and we need more. We need more support for these individuals. We don't need to be excluding them from the system. We need to find more inclusive ways to get them involved, and keep them away from the negative side aspects of society.
Ultimately, I think we can start out with eliminating zero tolerance policies and actually force administrators to critically examine based upon a situational occurrence.
Yeah, it's definitely a quick and easy step to take that would go in the right direction for sure.
Trooper, what do you think?
I think it's a very complicated issue. We've already discussed how complicated it is, but I do think getting rid of the zero tolerance is going to be beneficial, because I don't see that as really being the way to help these children become the people that society wants them to be. Basically, you're just making it harder on them. So I agree with you in that we have to do something else other than say zero tolerance. However, that being said, obviously you have the question. If somebody brings a gun to school, what do? Is it better to just send them out of school altogether and thus protect the school population? Or to, do some other technique? I can't even think of one off the top of my head. I don't know, rehabilitation, quote unquote, and hope that they don't bring a gun to school next time and shoot everybody. That's the real question, is if these people are dangerous. In that situation, I feel like it's more acceptable to be less tolerant. But in situations like drugs and foolish things, I do think they need to take it on a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm. Now, if a student had a gun, like we actually had that case come up in my school district, where a student my age actually brought a gun to school back when I was going to school. I would take it as more of a perspective of, well, why did they bring the gun to school? I mean, definitely they should be punished, absolutely, I'm not saying they shouldn't. Bringing a dangerous, deadly weapon to school is, regardless of circumstances, is not grounds for, light sentencing.
Right.
But it's more of, I would take the approach of that, of punishment, but also understanding why did that occur? What prompted them to bring a weapon? Were they being bullied by a group of people and they attempted to bring the gun to try and sway them off? Was it just to show off to friends? To show that they had it? What led to that situation coming up? And then what can be done to prevent that from coming up again? Talking with the student, talking with the parents, talking with their friends, trying to get to the heart of the matter, which is ultimately what zero tolerance policies don't allow you to do. Because there's so much nuance in everything we do that by simply sending them away or sending them to jail or something without understanding why that occurred leaves a security risk unattended and the heart of the matter still open.
Mm-hmm. No, and I agree with you in that regard. They do need to look at what's causing it, but I think that the safety of the other children, in regard to guns in particular, drugs is different, but in regards to guns in particular, I think the safety of the general population has to come first. And if that requires expelling, X number of people, then, utilitarian within me would say, well, you have to do what you have to do to protect the general population. But I would say, again, it's a case-by-case basis, even in that regard. Can I be lenient with this kid? Okay, maybe we could try to rehabilitate him or her or whatever. and go with that instead of necessarily just kicking them out of school. But I do think when it comes down to it, you do have to protect the people within it, the people who are obeying the rules. Now, you may say, that again still excludes X number of minorities, but whatever has to be done to stop people from shooting other people ought to be done.
And definitely, if I may respond to my chat really quickly, they're asking, is it dangerous to go to schools in the United States? They're from Europe. Generally, I would say most schools are relatively safe. It really just depends on where you are, what schools you're going to. If you're going to a school that's, I would say, unfortunately, in the inner city, those can be much more dangerous. There's increasing crime. Some schools have metal detectors when you walk in the door, and every school and every student is checked every day. It's quite extreme, the measures that some schools legitimately have to take to protect the student body. But ultimately, yes. Basically, the root of this is zero tolerance needs to go away, and nuance must be taken on a case-by-case basis for everything. In general. Right. Even with guns and drugs and such. Nuance and actual investigation must be taken. Would everybody agree on that statement?
I would think, again, I agree with you. Yes, it needs to be a case-by-case basis. But again, with regards to guns, there's only so much leniency you can give.
Of course, I'm not saying that they should be like, oh, you got a gun, slap on the wrist. I'm saying there should be punishments, definitely probably criminal punishments for sure. But I'm saying outside of that, understanding of why they brought it must be taken into effect.
Right. No,
Asimov? How do you feel?
I mean, I feel that there is definitely a lot we can do. A lot of this stems from obviously the an individual's feeling as though they have, like, for instance, with guns, it's a lack of recourse for these people. No student just brings a gun to school because they can, unless they're fucking sociopath. By and large, it's because they see no recourse to their action, to get the results that they need to feel as if they can feel safe, themselves can feel safe. So my point is that we need to focus, even especially in the criminal justice system. I'm also a major proponent of reforming, of rehabilitating people instead of being punitive, because what recourse does a person have when all they're looking at is more punitive measures? Like, what incentive do they have to become a better person if they're already stuck in a bad situation, and it looks like there's no way to get out, and they've already suffered punitive measures, and all they have to look forward to are stricter and stricter reactions to them. It's incentive. That's why the reoffending the reoffending rate in America is so high. It's because we don't care about these people. They don't know how. As soon as they get out of prison, they don't know how to live. And it's just one of those things where it starts early. We foster an environment where we focus too much on, we need to punish this person and job's done. Well, way to go, everybody. Let's all continue on with our lives.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you can definitely see that where you have people who are in prison for 5-10 years, and they get out, and there's like, okay, here you go, here's $40, here's a bus ticket to wherever you want to go, and there you go. People recommit because they want to go back in prison because that's what they understand, because they've been reprogrammed by the system to understand, well, if I do X, Y, or Z, I know I can expect this response. I'll get 3 meals a day, I'll get health care, I know how this system works. If there was a measure of rehabilitation, then you'd get, recidivism rate would go down, and you'd actually educate the prisoner population and give them skills they needed to be productive members of society once they leave prison.
And this more or less feeds into the first point of the next point that we're going to be talking about, which is prison,
Yes.
the prison labor system, in which the reoffending rates directly lead to profits for private companies.
So I would say we've succinctly covered the school to prison pipeline and its major causes and possible solutions and effects, say? Would
Sure,
everybody agree with
yeah.
this?
I mean, there's
All right.
probably always more to it, but I think as far as we understand the problem, we've hit pretty much everything we can.
Yeah. I would agree with that. All right. Are we still good?
Oh yeah.
To continue? Okay. Trooper, you still good?
Oh, I'm not good, but I'm here.
Well, I'd say let's continue on. So, our final topic for the evening is American manufacturing and its use of prison labor forces for profit. Would anybody care to take us off?
So basically, what's going on here? Back when we abolished the 13th Amendment, except as punishment for crime, which this is the one where we basically abolished slavery, saying that no private individual can own another person, again, unless it's in a prison, that the government can own slaves. Now, this was in 1865. The Virginia Supreme Court in 1871 they declared that prisoners were slaves of the state. And as far to my knowledge, this has not been challenged. And so now we have in 1948 was the year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights passed in the United Nations, giving everyone the right to form and join trade unions for the protections of their interests, which subsequently led to 1977, in which somehow the Supreme Court upheld a North Carolina a warden in North Carolina which banned prisoners from forming a labor union. So this is all just pointing to the fact that prisoners are slaves, that they have no rights as workers. In 1998, the number of prison jail industries reached 2,500 in America. And the minimum estimate of annual value prison and jail industrial output is estimated to be at about $2 billion annually.
Mm-hmm.
It's and it's to the point where literally 100% of inmates within anybody that's able-bodied within a federal prison is expected to work, whether this is on prison maintenance or on in companies like Unicor, which do a lot of the manufacturing. One of those two, 100% are required to work.
That's definitely something that I've seen from my own review. So actually, Unicor, they are an extremely major manufacturer of those things. Companies, I would say, that benefit, one of the top ones would be Arnmark. They are a food supply company which supplies over 600 prisons around North America. They recently, in about 2013, got a contract with the Michigan state government for $145 million for 3 years. And they've done a terrible job of it, with a long list of infractions, including meal shortages, unsanitary conditions like employees smuggling contraband to prisons. The state of food was so poor that it actually caused a riot, and the company skimping on providing meals to prisoners, which actually caused them to lose a contract in Florida. There are definitely companies profiting from the American prison system, whether it's directly by selling to them or whether it's the prisoners being the product sold. Let's see here. I remember there was a particular case. Yes, so, for instance, Whole Food, they are actually a major seller of tilapia. And you'd think, okay, well, tilapia comes from fish farms and such. But until April of this year, they had a California prisoners being their fish farm. They paid the Colorado Department of Department of Prisons or Labor, whatever the hell. Corrections, yes, thank you. Through a private prison to build, staff, and run a tilapia farm, which they then paid the prisoners between 23 cents to $1.15 an hour, or 23 cents to $1.15 per pound of tilapia, and they sold that tilapia for 11 cents, $12 per pound in their actual stores. So they're making slave laborers doing full-time work with none of the benefits whatsoever involved. I mean, it's essentially slave labor. I mean, what's a slave get out of it?
It is literally and legally slave labor.
I mean, they're forcefully captured due to crimes committed. They are paid a pittance. They are given food and housing, and they're expected to do work of a full-time person.
A really interesting point is that after the Civil War, after the slaves were freed, there was obviously a very, very large number of arrests made, against the recently freed black population, who were immediately just sent to jail and back out onto the fields. But then the government said nothing about this because, they're criminals now. What are we going to do? This whole system is designed, even our modern police force is designed around Southern slave catchers. The entire system is built around utilizing slave labor in our country, and it has not changed like one bit.
I mean, I would disagree with you on that point. I don't think the entire industry is built around it, but I think there are companies who see it and take advantage of it for their own benefit. I mean, most of America is a service industry. We work in shops and we resell products that are purchased from China. We're the slave labor there in China.
Yeah, like people talk about how we stop child labor and we got better work conditions for us. It's like, okay, well, what about the people we buy all of our stuff from now? They didn't end child labor and all this stuff. We just moved it to behind the curtain.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely ridiculous.
Absolutely. Trooper, your thoughts?
So I'll put it this way. An individual breaks the law. No, let me actually start over. Imagine society, okay? An individual breaks the laws of society. They are punished by being imprisoned, executed, exiled, whatever. It is not to rehabilitate the individual. It's to ensure the stability of their society. It's to say, okay, don't mess with us because we'll do X to you. Don't break our laws. Now, frankly, in my opinion, an individual breaks the law. They knew they were breaking the law. If you're not capable of understanding the law, you're mentally incapable. They don't, give you the same sentencing. Here in Texas, if you murdered somebody and you were retarded, you wouldn't be sentenced to death. you would get some other sentence. You still committed the crime, but you wouldn't be held to the same standard as somebody who knew what they were doing.
I would like to point out real quick that that is not objectively true. There are many cases of Texas executing people that have mental illnesses and like severe mental impairments.
According
Mental
to the
illness?
Texas law, what constitutes mental illness to the point that we won't execute you, they did not meet that criteria. Now, onward to my original point. They've already broken their laws. Whatever benefits they had as a member of that society, they've already trampled upon by breaking the rules of that society. Therefore, what right do they have to any sort of protection by that society's laws, except for what the members of, the good standing members of that society wish to give them? So my point is this: if you break the law and you're sent to a prison and they require you to grow your own food, you can bitch about it, but it doesn't really make a difference. You broke the laws of your society. I don't really have an ear for you.
Hmm. But that's not the problem. The problem isn't prisoners working fields to produce.
It's the same thing, though. They're working
No.
for the company. Where does the company's money go?
The money's go
They
back
make
to the
money.
company.
Yeah, these aren't companies that are they're not saying that these prisoners should work on the prisons themselves, to grow their own food, to do this. No, they're doing things like I'm pretty sure, I believe I read that 70 to 90% of all solar panels used within America are made by slave labor. These companies are producing for a profit. It's not about maintaining prisons. It's about the people who own these companies incentivizing people getting caught and getting sentenced, which is where mandatory minimums, where 3-strike laws, shit like that, all that feeds into this this whole atmosphere we have of we need to get people in prison so that they can do manufacturing work for us, and then we can utilize the goods generated by these people to cut costs and make more money for the shareholder.
Hmm.
Like, I personally wouldn't necessarily have a big problem. Like in France, I mean, obviously, I still have many issues with France and their prison system. But one thing that they do have is they do require prisons to work on anything that they use themselves. And there's the part of me that's like, yeah, okay, whatever, it's not terrible. But I'm still in favor of rehabilitating these people so that they can re-enter society as functioning members, instead of just being pariahs that just get sent right back, which is what we do here. But at least it's not here.
Because I mean, like I said, I would be fine if prisoners produced food and did jobs to for the prison, because I understand that by that nature, it cuts costs for the prison and gives them skills and such.
Which is actually true. Most prison labor, is upkeep. It is maintenance on the prison itself. But they do have enough labor left over that they can utilize that labor to, to profit off of it. On top of that.
But a lot of this comes from, part of it is the private prison complex, but a part of it is the drug war. That's what a lot of people don't talk about, is the drug war accounts for current population of people in prison. 46% of them are in prison for drug offenses. If how many of those are nonviolent, that would remain to be seen. But I mean, whenever you have a country and a culture that's built around extreme punishment of harmless drugs to inflate a population of prisoners and increase, your labor, it says something about the society and culture. Because I mean, whenever people, make serious bank off of imprisoning people into prisons, and companies take advantage of that under different methods, it really puts a light on why we do it. Whenever you have prisoners, I would be fine, honestly, if prisoners made minimum wage. in doing this job. You know, I would be fine with that if they were going to raise tilapia or manufacture products or assemble furniture, but they were getting paid minimum wage. You know, I wouldn't have a problem with that.
I mean, I still would have an issue with it, but I would have less of an issue.
I mean, the source of it, yeah, but I mean, I'd have a great less of an issue. But right now, when they're getting paid 23 cents, an hour, 50 cents, maybe $1 in some places.
Yeah, I think the highest paid prison workers, I think they're getting paid like $1.30 an hour somewhere. I don't remember where or what they're doing, but I think that's the highest paid in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Then, I mean, what else can you call that but slave labor? Trooper, your thoughts?
Well, first off, I would start by saying when the individual company excels, their profits, they have to pay taxes, of course. And so thus the state and federal government does make money. So, I don't care if people within the prison system are forced to work, because basically my tax dollars go to support your existence within that prison system. Again, you violated the laws of the society you are basically within a contract with. So my compassion for that particular individual's rights go extremely down. I just don't care. You violated the laws. What do you want me to do? Now, if an individual is being forced to work in that situation, you can say, well, that's unfair. That's slave labor. I would say, frankly, what else are they doing in that situation? Is it really that big of a deal? The biggest thing for me is not that they're required to work within the prison system. It's the possibility that people are being shuffled into the prison system to support that labor. If they're already there for something they've done, I don't care if they work. Now, if they're being shuffled there to continue that work, that's the point where I don't believe that's a sustainable system. I don't think that's right.
Which is exactly what we do. That's the whole reason. That's part of the reason why we started the war on drugs in the first place, was because prison populations were declining, and we needed a new way to get people in prison. So we invent laws that we didn't previously have that were not necessarily an issue, and invent crises so that we have a reason to put people in prison. Mm-hmm. And just by the fact that prisons can profit off of prisoners gives them an incentive to maintain those populations. It does not give them an incentive to help these people. It doesn't give them an incentive to rehabilitate these people so that they're more use to us as a society. It creates an incentive for them to keep them in prison so that these individuals help them. And that's the issue that I primarily have.
Yeah, no, that definitely occurs. Looking at the drug war and the source of it, I mean, every major drug is tied to a group. Opium's tied to the Chinese. Marijuana's tied to Mexicans. Cocaine and crack cocaine's tied to the black community. These drugs and these outlawing of them were put in place originally to target certain groups of people that they did not like. And then it was
just to point out real quick, there is very solid evidence that, the Reagan administration, supplied crack to the black communities just so that they could eventually incarcerate them for it.
I won't talk about that. Unsubstantiated claims. I don't have enough time to evidence. But but it definitely shows a culture in America of, imprisonment for prisons. Because, whenever the drug war happened, before the drug war really occurred, we didn't see private prisons. They didn't exist in the prominence that they do today. But once the drug war happened, and people started saying, hey, well, there's going to be this huge spikes in prisons, and the private and the public prison system can't handle them. I'm going to get into this business. I'm going to make a prison. I'm going to, run it and, charge the government outrageous rates. Because when you have prisons charging the government at, say, whenever they do these contracts, they say, well, we're going to have a prison, and we're going to charge you at 90% occupancy. If we ever dip below 90% occupancy, we're going to charge you at 90%. So these prisons could hold 50% people, be charging the government at 90% occupancy, and then just be making all that pure profit. Coupled with whatever they get paid from whatever private industries they have exploiting the labor. But I mean, part of it is, like I said, the drug war, whenever you have such a massive population based on drugs. I mean, I'm of the opinion that you should just legalize and regulate all drugs. Heroin, crack cocaine, whatever. Fuck it. Legalize it, regulate it, tax it. You know, get people who want to get help the ease of access to rehabilitation. Or if they're repeat offenders, you know, just force them into rehabilitation. But I mean, if we eliminated the drug wars, I mean, the prisons, a lot of them would be rather bare.
And we would not have a need for nearly as many prisons as we have.
I mean, it would eliminate the major function of the private prison industry.
We certainly can't have that.
Shaper, your thoughts? You're feeling you're kind of quiet.
Yeah, no, this is just one of those subjects. You know, I spent a lot of time thinking. You know, in this regard, so you can claim that the federal government made drugs illegal because they wanted to have a sustainable prison population. Or you could also say that they made drugs illegal because you were having large groups of people using these drugs and committing crimes or what have you. Maybe they just don't like drugs. Maybe
Nixon talked about it. Like, there in the Nixon tapes, he talked about, between him and his major advisor, that he was starting the drug war against marijuana specifically to target the Hispanic population because he feared that the Hispanic population would be a major Democratic voting base, so he didn't want them gaining, you know, the ability to vote. So making it federal crimes, making it a felony, removes your ability to vote. Thus forth, removing your voting base. So there is clear evidence that at least that particular function of it was in part
Political.
Political.
Political and economic.
Mm-hmm.
In this particular regard, I mean, I can understand what you're saying. However, I have a hard time saying, I agree with you because I have yet to hear this tape for myself.
No, that's fine. I understand.
You know, this is one of those things where I don't want to call it a conspiracy, but basically it is possible. Do I believe it? Not necessarily, but it is possible that, you know, the war on drugs was created to sustain a prison population so that, you know, so that somebody can keep themselves in noob shoes. I, however, have a hard time buying into the idea that they were created, again, merely to do that. And again, with my previous opinion as far as prison labor is concerned, you know, there is also the other question. Frankly, if you don't break the law, you don't have to worry about going to jail and being conscripted into a labor force. There is always the option of, you know, not breaking the law.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a touchy subject for sure. With the drug war, how it is, I'm not saying the drug war was started for the profiting of prisons. I'm saying it was more started for political reasons.
Right.
But I'm saying that the prison industry has developed as a result of the drug war and the prisoners being taken advantage of under major corporations. I mean, so much companies take advantage of prisoners. And I mean, it's not right I disagree China using slave labor, but that happens because, you know, just low wages. I mean, I disagree when any country does it, and it's happening here in America. And I think we have a duty to be, as an American, you know, we talk about freedom and ethics and, you know, responsible government and shit. You know, we should practice what we preach. Now, not to say that prisoners should be just left idle. I mean, I don't disagree that prisoners should have jobs. I just agree that they should be paid at least a minimum wage for products that are being produced. Because if a company can't produce on its own, if a company can't survive on its own without using prison labor, then it probably shouldn't be around. You know, stand on your own feet and all that jazz.
Right. I would state one thing that if a company was going to use prison labor, I have no problem with them not paying the individual at all, so long as the state, the government, you know, which is shilling out the money to take care of these people, is the one benefiting from that profit. You see what I'm saying? It's not going to private corporations, but back to the state.
Which
Because
a lot of
we all know
the
what we need to do, you know, to house people.
which interestingly enough, a lot of these corporations not only do not have to pay taxes on their profits because they are still technically housing wards of the state. They're doing their whole idea is that they're providing a service, and what they do with that service and how they profit off of it is their, you know, it's their thing, and by and large they are not required to pay taxes on profits from that. However, obviously, you know, people who are paid through that system do have to pay, you know, income taxes and stuff like that. But, you know, if you're, you know, you can still use all that company money to do any number of things with. And it's a huge, just ridiculous amount of bullshit as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I still argue that it is an economically based, you know, motivation. You know, we got Death here saying that, you know, he does believe that, you know, the war on drugs was primarily political, and I think it was at best an equal split between political and economic, because we've had, you know, immediately after, like I said, immediately after the Civil War, a lot of the recently freed slaves were thrown into prisons for violating, you know, this such and such law that they had absolutely no idea existed, because, you know, they've been slaves their entire life. How are they supposed to know, you know, that, you know, they can't do a business thing here, that they can't grow, you know, they think, oh, hey, this land's not being used, let's use this. And then all of a sudden some slave catchers come by and say, hey, you know, you're not allowed to do this here, you're under arrest and you're going to prison for violating private property rights. And, you know, it's a system that has been existing since, you know, the abolishment, quote unquote, of slavery. It's just how it's just been a large part of our country's economy since inception, and it's absolutely disgusting.
Part of that, definitely, between the different cultures, has quite an effect. I'm trying to think here, because I think we're all running out of words to say, as much as I'm loath to say it. But the prison complex definitely has something to do. I'm just saying words right now. None of it's making any sense.
It makes sense. It's just they don't have a particular purpose.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
It's blather.
I'm just trying to fill the air between responses.
So I think we know, you know, what our individual stances are on this.
Well, then I suppose a simple summarization, because ultimately, okay, fine. Here, what would be a good resolution for this then? For everybody, how would be the best way to resolve this? Would you just let it continue the practice? Possibly make some adjustments, increase wages, decrease wages, change it up to adjust how the program works. what would you do to resolve this situation if you would do anything?
I would like to speak first, if I may.
Yes.
I would like to start with we should completely absolve society and return to a system of anarchy where we all just live in the trees and we don't have to worry about.
I would like to point out real quick that anarchy is not a society without rules. It is a society without rulers, and that is a very important distinction.
Ooh. It's definitely quite true.
I see. Well, then let me use a different term, not anarchy. Actually, I don't know if there is a term to describe the state of natural man before the advent of society and laws.
I mean, there's always been, a social contract from, any given group. There's always been, hey, don't kill me because I don't want to kill you, and we can work together, together to make things better for everybody else. Like, that's kind of been our thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's something I want to return to, is much more emphasis on that.
Okay, so ultimately, for me, based on my point of view, I would say for the practice to continue, because, I understand companies want to make money, companies outsource all the time, but if it's going to be in America, they're going to at least have to pay minimum wage. That's like my bare allowance for this practice to continue, is at least paying these prisoners minimum wage, and introduce a culture of rehabilitation for these prisoners to make it, less profitable, less, of a thing to stay in prison than it is to go out there to the outside world and get a job with the skills developed. And ending the drug war. just those couple points. Azam, have your thoughts?
This just ties into my whole outlook on the economic system as a whole, in that, we focus way too much on, people making money and, being occupied with their jobs. And it's like, we don't necessarily need to be doing that. We are at a point where we can reasonably live within a post-scarcity society, but we don't, because that wouldn't make money for people who run the system as a whole. So we still end up with systems like what we have now, in which we force prisoners to work for a pittance so that those people can keep making money. I'd say removing the incentive to profit off of them would be, if we have to work with solutions within the current frame, the current frame right now, I would say that removing the incentive to incarcerate individuals definitely would be a good step in the right direction, on top of removing the punitive, like moving away from a punitive system towards a rehabilitation, so that we don't, because in a society we shouldn't want people to reoffend just so that we can continue to profit off of them. We should want them to be better so that they can be they can contribute at a higher level than manual labor, which honestly we should all be doing with goddamn robots at this point anyway. It's just,
Trooper?
It's a lot of stuff.
Your thoughts, Trooper? Even though I see you're playing Rocket League?
What a punk with his mic off.
Is he? He is indeed muted.
He is muted.
I did not realize. I've been talking for like a couple minutes. I didn't realize I was muted.
I've not heard a thing you said.
Yeah, no, I apologize. No, I was, of course, joking earlier. The real issue here for me is not that any sort of, prison requires that the inmates work. I could care less if they work and what they get paid to work. The main issue for me is that it's it would be, if it is run by companies who do it for profit. Again, if they're working like here in Texas, I've seen a great many prisons that do this, and my brother works at one. Where the prisoners are required to labor for their food. They have a certain amount of land that they work, and they grow food on that land. And I don't have any issue with that. I have issue with private companies making money off of the prison labor. If they do it merely for the benefit of the state, because as we all know, it does take money to house criminal offenders. If they're using that money to provide and support these people within the prison system, then I'm perfectly fine with that. But if it's, going to external groups, which, you could say cyclically, it comes around and it supports the people in power because these special interest groups are paying them, or, they're getting taxed and it's paying for the local economies and this and that, and that's, good. I think the best way to deal with that in the future is merely to have those companies owned and operated for the benefit of the state as a whole, or the federal government as a whole, whatever.
So you're for the public and the federal state interest employing prisoners for the benefit of the state to provide a profit margin to decrease their overall costs and expenditures to the taxpayer overall, but not for the benefit of private corporations taking advantage of people in that way?
Yes, exactly. And of course, there is always the question of what happens if this particular industry, say, I don't know, the prisoners are making chairs and all of a sudden this is actually making money for the state. What do you do with that money? And they're not only breaking even, but it's making money for the state. They need to use that money to fund rehabilitative efforts. Mm-hmm. Because, the idea is to have a balanced budget entirely where, we're not paying money. The taxpayer is not paying money to house criminals, but at the same time where the state government isn't balancing their budget based on prison labor. Mm-hmm. It's really quite a sensitive line, because you're going to have people who would, of course, say, well, it's better for the state that we, refuse to pay these guys and we have this huge population because now the state's making a lot of money, which you could argue is objectively good anyway.
Mm-hmm. So let's boil it down for, I guess, a closing summarization. So I think we can agree on a couple points. The company's use of prisoners for profits and labor source at extremely reduced rates should be eliminated. And on a split point, that the prisons should be operated, that prisoners should be allowed to work and provide labor for the benefit of the state and government to reduce their total cost to the taxpayers.
Yes, I would agree with that. Additionally, because you would say, well, what's the incentive for the prisoner, working within this system? If they're not making enough money, they're making a pittance or nothing at all, what's the incentive for them to work? You can, of course, commute their sentences based on their quote unquote labor. They're working down their debt to society quite literally.
Mm-hmm. Asimov, how do you feel?
I feel like if you create any sort of situation where you incentivize the incarceration of individuals as a way that directly benefits a private or public entity, you are only creating an incentive to incarcerate people.
I think short of, the state government and the police officers framing individuals just to put them in jail, whether they have an incentive to incarcerate them or not, they can't do anything about it except look, with extra scrutiny. Whereas, of course, my previous statement that if you're not breaking the law, you don't exactly have anything to...
I mean, that's not objectively true either. There's lots of people that are sent to prison or are given, inappropriate or disproportionate punishments for crimes that, they should not have such ridiculous crime shit for.
Well, that's a
Well,
separate subject, and
yeah.
whether or not they were guilty is a case-by-case basis, which is decided by a jury of their peers.
Yeah. So ignoring all extraneous things, simply based upon labor in prisons, I would say Trooper stands with eliminating private entities profiting off of prisoners, but allowing state interests to profit in a method of reducing costs to the prisons and public overall, versus Asimov's, which is the complete elimination of the labor industry in prisons for both private and public entities to de-incentivize the government for imprisoning people for profit. Would y'all agree on those statements?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
At least in my regard, yes.
Asimov?
Yep, sounds right.
Okay, so it's clear that we'll never come to a complete resolution, and that's perfectly fine. We all have our own opinions and thoughts and things. But I would say we've come to an understanding on the 3 points that we discussed today: the school system, the school-to-prison pipeline, and then ultimately American manufacturing and their profiteering off of prisoners. I would say this was a very good conversation. I think we got a lot of different viewpoints and ideas and such for solutions. How do y'all feel?
I feel like this is a particular subject, whereas your various camps are likely never to completely agree with what ought to be done in this situation. But mutual understanding, is capable, and I believe, at the very least, I understand your various positions and the arguments thereof. Or therein, rather.
Asimov?
I mean, I feel that the conversation here is, with most things, obviously we get a little carried off with tangents on these arguments, which I do feel is kind of a double-edged sword, in that we do have the issues themselves, which are directly affected, obviously, by a lot of the things that we end up talking about as a tangent. So, there's just so much nuance to a lot of these issues that ends up needing to be discussed, but it usually ends up getting put to the side so that we can so you can retain focus on what is viewed as the problem that is being discussed. So I do feel that while these talks do help each other, they do help one another understand where they're coming from with their opinions. I do feel that ultimately that these kinds of discussions are simply meant as a way of not necessarily trying to find answers, but simply getting them out. Just venting the ideas that you have stored, which serves a purpose. I do believe that that's helpful, but ultimately that is what it is. Like there's too much nuance to issues like this to accurately or comprehensively get to them in such a short period of time, and you just and to make any sort of qualitative answer as to the status of them in regards to a dialogue that we just had is not an accurate representation of the complexities of the issues themselves and people's individual feelings on them. They're just they're more like snapshots, and you're just missing a lot on the outside, which is fine.
And ultimately, that's all that really could be done.
Yeah.
I mean, we'd have to be studying policies, and we'd essentially have to be, this would be a full-time job for us for a particular issue if we wanted to get all the nuance and such resolved. We are only simply discussing it in the time that we have in the manner that we have due to the nature of it, you know.
Right.
So, ultimately, yes, these are for our benefits, but I also like to think that we are starting a conversation with the viewers and, you know, prompts them to think about the topics that we discuss in a different manner, from, you know, because we all have different perspectives in how we approach things. And I think it really helps inform people in a subject they may not know have existed before. I mean, ultimately, I know nuance is so very deep in these subjects, but we must cover what we can.
I'm just gonna say nuance about 4 times and hope it sounds good. I'm not making fun of you. It was a joke.
Well, go ahead and use them. Let's see where it goes.
Nuance.
That's nonsense.
It was a joke.
It was a very nuanced position.
It was a very nuanced joke. No, and of course you could argue about the futility of these types of arguments. You know, unless you are a policymaker within your state or federal government, you know, our purpose in discussing this is either for our own personal enjoyment, our edification, or for the benefit of the listener who may not, you know, have any idea as to if this is an issue, if this exists, what it is, or, you know, they may just want to hear our particular opinions on this subject. You know, so what you're trying to get out of this type of conversation, you know, has a lot to do with whether or not it was successful. But in my regard, you know, I'm here to have an intellectual conversation about topics that, while this may not necessarily pertain to me, as I've never been incarcerated and, you know, never been enslaved, they do make a difference as far as how your vote is cast in the future. We talked about this last time, that, you know, the way we make a difference here in America is by casting our ballot. So if this is a serious issue to any of the listeners, of course, then you may, you know, want to consider your future candidate's stance on, you know, this particular subject. But otherwise, you know, there really is no purpose to us discussing it other than just having a good time discussing our opinions about a sensitive topic.
Right. It's have either of you seen Thank You for Smoking?
I don't think I have. I've heard of it, but I don't think I've seen it.
One of my favorite parts was when this man who lobbies for the tobacco industry, who obviously, you know, he goes on talk shows all the time and all this nonsense. He is talking with his son, and he explains to his son. He has a fake argument with him about the virtues of vanilla versus chocolate ice cream, and his son goes, "Well, you didn't convince me though. Like, what's the point?" And so Dad goes, "The point isn't to convince you; it's to convince everybody watching."
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
basically.
Yep.
Because, you know, the people who are in this conversation, and maybe not necessarily us in particular, but when a person is forced, or rather just does, you know, state and defend their position, they tend to become, you know, defensive by title, you know, of their position. So it's going to be, of course, more difficult, if not impossible, to actually convince somebody in a debate, that person in particular. So I would agree with you. You know, we're not here to really convince each other, but rather to convince anybody listening, or perhaps even ourselves, you know, that our stance withstands the battery of other positions.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, if so happens that our positions do change based upon the arguments presented here, well, then all for the better, if they were well reasoned and intoned. But I'm going to bring this show to a close, I would say. Thank you for joining us, Asimov, Trooper. I felt that we had a very interesting, relatively in-depth, for as much as we could, conversation about the respective topics. The quality of the American education system, the school-to-prison pipeline, and the American manufacturing in its taking advantage of American prisoners. I would like to thank the audience for viewing this, and I hope you will join us